So I'm going to turn it over, in the interest of time, over to Debbie. Let's give her a big round of applause.
So we've had all these kind of amazing, super advanced demos, and I'm going to have the most low-tech demo ever. So I have 3 things. So I'm going to hand these around. These 2 bags, which look superficially identical, are different. So I'm going to ask you to take 1 strip of plastic from each bag, and then I'm going to ask you to grab a paper clip. So I'm going to give these to you and have them start to go around. So if when your side is done, pass it over to the other side, so that if everyone can get one in about 10 or so minutes, that would be great. What's up? No, they're different. All 3 of those things are different. Yeah. Yeah. So then, if you can start on opposite sides, and we can all play nice and swap them over. Yeah. So you should at the end of this, you should have 3 different things, and I promise you, the pieces of plastic are distinguishable. They're labeled, minimally, but labeled. So. Okay, so I'm a professor of material science, and I commented earlier that you can tell this is a really great conference because it seems like a whole bunch of us are like, I totally want to redo my talk, like in the break before I have to speak. But I actually love the fact that I'm kind of bookending this with Charlotte's talk, because we're both sort of deeply into materials and talking about the materials thing. The specific thing that I'm going to be focusing on is the process piece. So Charlotte talked about, she sort of alluded to the fact that she gets these things 3D printed and waxed, and then she casts them, and there's some issues with like making sure that the quality control comes out right? I'm seeing that sort of look. And Nina showed us those amazing shots inside Levi's of all the stuff the textiles go through during the processing process. So of course, I teach material science, and one of the things that's fun about teaching material science is that we are in contact with materials kind of our entire lives. Like basically, like since you were born and swaddled, right, or like someone with latex gloves was the first thing you touched in the outside world, we're sort of constantly pretty much in contact with materials, like other than like when we're swimming and a few other unusual circumstances. So the consequence of that, as all of you have realized, it's been kind of a running theme today, is that we actually have a really deep understanding of how materials function in the world. And in fact, I was actually speaking to someone who was talking about sort of uploading your brain to the singularity, and the thing I said to him was that all of our interactions with the material world are computationally intense. Right? So like a mole of atoms, so like 12 grams of carbon has 6.02 times 10 to the 23 atoms in it. And the behavior that we're used to dealing with in sort of all materials has to do with the way all of those atoms interact with each other. So one of the things that I think about is that if you're trying to like model the behavior in the real world is like, either you're going to have the equivalent of like a handful of jerky polygons, right? Or you're basically just going to take people's uploaded brains and tell them that the world is basically like polygons, right? Because to computationally model this incredibly complicated world that we're in requires thinking about a lot of atoms interacting in a lot of ways. So we have this like really deep understanding of the behavior, right? We just do this without thinking about it at all. We also have a fairly good understanding of what things are made out of. Right? So I handed around 3 things, and no one has any difficulty in identifying the strips that's made of plastic, and probably a few of you could tell me what kind of plastic, and no one, most of you would be easily recognize the paperclip as definitely metal, and probably a lot of you would immediately recognize that as aluminum, right? So we're really good at like, this is what it's made out of, and we're really good at these are the physical properties. The space that we don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about is everything that happens in between those 2. And so there's 2 major components. So one is the processing, which is how do you get from sort of the raw material to the thing you hold in your hand that behaves in a way that you expect. And the other thing that we don't think about is the sort of commensurate thing of, okay, it's made out of certain atoms, so the aluminum paperclip is made out of aluminum atoms, and then it has the sort of macroscopic paperclip style structure, but there's a whole lot of structure that's happening in between. So for this conference, when I talked to Brian about what I should talk about, and I said if we're going to think of the web as a material, most people's understanding of material is the what it's made out of piece and how it behaves piece. And so I wanted to spend a bunch of time in those intermediate levels. So that's what I'm going to be talking about mostly today. So I like to say the materials are the infrastructure of design. And again, as most people in this room know, the affordances of the material are what makes design possible and what makes particular designs possible. So one of my favorite examples of this is the screen on the iPhone, the glass screen, which probably lots of you know is made of Gorilla Glass. That technology was invented in the early part of the 20th century, right, to make glass that is, has lots of the properties that we like of glass, but it's much less resistant to breaking. And I know probably most people in this room, how many of us have dropped our phone and broken the glass? Yeah. On the other hand, so it's like it still breaks. On the other hand, you probably dropped your phone more than once, or you dropped it in a particularly bad way before it broke. So Gorilla Glass was invented in the early part of the 20th century, and it wasn't used for a lot of things because it's an expensive technology, right? It's hard to make. And so it wasn't really until Apple started looking around for, we want a glass, but we need it to be more resistant to breaking than regular glass, that they found that Corning had invented this extremely expensive glass, but because the price point of iPhones is really different, it meant that there was suddenly a use case for this that made sense both in terms of the physical affordances, but also in terms of the economics of it. So basically the whole sort of glass touchscreen was sort of made possible by the fact that this technology existed and then was brought forward. And of course, for Corning, it's been a lifesaver, right? That it's they went from not that they were like not lifesavers, maybe not too strong a word, but certainly it's like an enormous component of their business now, right? So this new technology. So the idea is that different materials that have different behaviors are kind of what makes design possible. And so in the case of this glass, it's a good example of how it wasn't like that it's made of glass. Glass is a technology that we've known for thousands and thousands of years. It was that there was this new technology that made this new kind of design possible. And that's a pretty common theme, as I said, as I'm sure many people in this room are aware, even if they've never phrased it in that way. So I'm going to talk about a case study of process, and it's one that I'm sure everyone in this room, actually I know everyone in this room is familiar with, because as I said, I'm bookending Charlotte's talk. So we talked about 3D printing. This is actually one of the sort of fabrication rooms at Autodesk's Pier 9 creative fabrication facility in San Francisco, where I did a fellowship 2 years ago now. So the key idea here is that all 3D printing is additive fabrication. So instead of taking a solid material and taking away what you don't want, you sort of start and you build up what you want. And Charlotte alluded to some of the processes. She talked about sintering titanium, and she also talked about the sort of plastic extrusion process, right? And there's a number of sort of other processes that are used, but all of them are about sort of positioning. Oh, you talked about the resin, the UV curing of resin, right? And so all of these are like processes where you kind of have voxels, right? You basically build it up sort of by sort of increments of volume into the whole. And so the process is how do you actually put the pieces together to make these increments. So a few years ago, when Pirate Bay started hosting STL files for 3D printing, they posted, so there was a blog post about this, and I had this quote, the benefit to society is huge, no more shipping huge amounts of products around the world, no more shipping with the broken products back, no more child labor. We'll be able to print food for hungry people. We'll be able to share not only a recipe, but a full meal. And I read it, and I was like, dude, that's a replicator. Like, that's not 3D printing, that's a replicator. And of course, there are lots of fascinating questions about replicators and transporters and where the raw materials come from. And if anyone was happy wants to nerd out about that with me. But this is how getting food to hungry people, what it actually looks like, right? This is airdropping rice. And so one of the things that comes out of this is that it's actually the raw material, right, not the process. 3D printing, additive manufacturing is a process. It's not the raw material. It's not a substitute for the raw material. And right now, it has kind of a limited range of things, but that's growing. This is an example of sintered ceramic out of a lab at the University of Washington. And a slide of like what's kind of new in 3D printing, what materials are available, is more or less instantly out of date, right? Because this is sort of a growing area of bringing both new materials on board. Charlotte and I were actually talking about MIT now has one that extrudes glass, right? And at like basically molten glass, so like glowing orange hot glass. So this is a moving target, right? But the processes and the materials are different. So this is a picture of a 3D printed hamburger. And this is, again, what 3D printer actually looks like. But you can see some key issues here, right? So one of them is, where did that meat come from? Right? Like, has it been kept appropriately cold for food safety this entire time? So that's sort of like the obvious one, right? Where's the supply chain? And then, then you can go back farther, right? Which is like, was that meat produced in a way that's sustainable, that, makes sense for the animals, that makes sense for the environment? And then there's the other thing, of course, is that this hamburger is not made. Post-processing matters, right? What happens after you 3D print it? In this case, putting it on a grill matters. And then there's like one last subtle point, which is, how many people here have made hamburgers from scratch? Some of you? Okay, so if you've ever made hamburgers from scratch, one of the things that matters is that you can't overwork it, right? So when you're making it, you can't like smush it sort of indefinitely. You actually want to handle it as little as possible so it has the right texture. So that kind of processing makes a difference. And as I think is not a spoiler, I think I've alluded to this enough. This is kind of the central tenet of material science, right? Which is that the material, so what something is actually made out of, the processing, which is the techniques you use to manufacture it, but also the techniques you use to get specific properties, and then the properties, the outcome that you get, are all inextricably linked. So that you can't, basically, if you pick one of these or two of these, then you've sort of gotten the next one. And so if you're thinking about, okay, if I like a metal, it's like these are the processing techniques available, and then these are the properties. So one way of thinking about 3D printing is that it's a specific processing technique, right, which is amenable to certain types of materials, but then it gives you a certain set of properties. And some of those properties can be fairly subtle in terms of what actually is happening with them. So I'm going to start with a familiar example to many of us. Again, how many people here have made bread? So this is actually one of the few cases where we actually go through this whole process. So in this case, you start with a set of ingredients and you make a dough, and this is actually no knead bread. But again, if you've ever made bread that involves kneading, the processing, right? The process of kneading is what actually makes the gluten networks that lead to the crumb, which is what you see in the end. So this is an example where we actually do the whole thing. We start with the raw materials. We follow sort of specific processes that give us how you knead it, how you bake it, right? How you let it rise and so forth, right? It's sort of a series of processes to get to the sort of final desired output. And I've actually baked my share of bread that came out like a cannonball, right? So sometimes it's the non-desired output at the end of it. And I'd actually just like to thank my friend John Gallagher, he's actually a history professor at the University of Leeds, hence his handle. And he got a message from me like last night saying like, it just occurred to me in the shower that I can talk about bread. Do you have any pictures you can send me? So thanks for him for coming through. So a much less quotidian example. So this is a Japanese sword. This is a katana. And you can see that kind of watermarked thing. And probably most of you are sort of familiar with the idea that like Japanese metalsmithing and swordsmithing is like is a real thing, right? It's a craft. It's it's many hundreds of years old. It requires sort of enormous apprenticeships and like deep understanding of the materials to get what you produce. And so here's a little thought experiment, right? You could 3D print a katana at like sub-micron resolution, right? So it looks like a katana, except that, and you can probably figure out what I'm going to say next, right? It will not have the physical properties of a katana, right? Because and this is also true for like if you have like a chef's knife at home, because the physical properties that it gets are actually a product of, in the case of metals, this incredibly complicated forging, rolling, heating, cooling, that entire process to make what the final product is. So I actually have sort of two kind of quotidian examples for you today. So the first one is actually, did everyone get the demo material? So everyone has a paperclip? Actually, let me ask you the other way. Does anyone not have a paperclip and 2 strips of plastic? It didn't, okay, so I'm actually do you have paperclips though? We'll start with the paperclips. And so if we can make sure that this side gets both strips of plastic. So if you can take your paperclip and you can sort of unbend it, and then I'm going to ask you to and this is all you're going to do, is you're going to take it and you're going to bend it at one point, and then unbend it at that point and bend it at that point again. So you're not just kind of bending it at random, you're bending it in the same place multiple times. So, yeah, so here, I don't think I have one up here, but I will demo with something else. So here's a dongle. Actually, it's probably better if I actually do it with something that's a little bit more visible. So if this is your paperclip, you've unbent it, right? So bend it in one spot, unbend it, bend it again in the same spot, unbend it. So what do we notice? Do we notice anything? So it breaks. What happens before it breaks? It gets softer right before it breaks. What happens before that, though? Does anyone notice that it gets harder? Right? So the first one is either, in fact, often the second or third one will try to put itself in a different spot if you're not careful, because it will try to break where it's, or to bend where it's soft. So, so this is like a super simple example of like you are processing this aluminum and changing its properties, right? And so the good news is that you're making it harder, right, just by bending it back and forth, because you're moving the atoms around in a particular way. The bad news is that you're actually making it more brittle, which is why if you do it a couple more times, it breaks. And in fact, it's easier right before it breaks because you've started putting cracks in it. So there's actually less material for you to move around. And so then it breaks. OK, how are we doing with strips of plastic? Does everyone have 2 strips? Or which strip do you have? Does the line parallel or perpendicular to the long section? We'll start with that one. So I can't see the line on it, but is the line this way, or is it that way? It's this way. It's like up, down with the long axis. Yes? OK, so we can start with that one. And now I actually really do need one of each for myself. Thanks, Nina. OK. So these are just cut from a regular shopping bag, a regular carrier bag from a local grocery store. These are actually increasingly hard to get where I live. I went into my deep stash because I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they actually ban single-use plastic bags. So you have to pay 10 cents for either a paper bag or a reusable plastic bag, which is actually kind of interesting because when plastic bags were first introduced, they were kind of marketed as these bags last forever, they're super strong and they're hygienic. And then very quickly the manufacturers realized that if you gave people bags and you expected them to reuse them, it was hard to sell lots of bags. Rose Eveleth she has a podcast called, I want to say Fast Forward. It's not called Fast Forward. It's something very close to Fast Forward. And Flash Forward. Yes, that is a podcast about looking at different futures. And one of the futures she looked at was a future where plastic was banned. And so as part of that meant going back into the past about where plastic came from. And I highly recommend it. So let's see. Let's start with the crosswise one. So actually, let's start with the up-down one. So you have 2. So we're going to start with this one, which has the up-down. And the thing I'm going to ask you to do, and we're going to do a mechanical test of this, but we're going to do the mechanical test. I usually do this on a big machine called an inchtron. We're going to do it with our hands. So what you want to do is you want to pull it apart slowly and evenly. And the easiest way to do that, can everyone see my hands? Is to hold it sort of between your thumbs and then gradually pull on it. Pull, 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 until it breaks. OK. So that's our first one. So that was the up-down direction. So now that you have like little bits of plastic around, we're going to do the crosswise one. And we're going to do a little comparison. So this is the one that has, how are we doing? OK. I was about to say, you can break this with your bare hands. I believe in you. OK, so now we have the crosswise one, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to hold it carefully between our thumb and our hands. And now we're going to pull it again, and you're going to see what you see. So what do we notice? It behaves pretty differently, right? Was it easier or harder to pull to stretch out? It was easier to start, right? And then there was a sort of process where it went. And then once you got to that point where it's all stretched out, then it's actually pretty hard again, right? Then it's actually surprisingly hard to pull apart. So what does this mean? It means that, actually, do you want the explanation first, or do you want what it means first? How many people want the explanation first? Everyone wants to know what it means first and then the explanation. That seems fair. So what it means is that this, which is like the single cheapest, most disposable type of plastic, even this has a processing, the processing of it matters. And so the way you make this kind of film is you draw the plastic out. And so when you make the bag, and so this is like the first one we pulled on, right? That's the side that's already been drawn out. So it's already pretty strong and pretty stiff in that up-down direction. The crosswise one, so pulling it this way, is the other direction. So the sheets were drawn like this, but if you pulled it across that direction, it's actually much softer, much more deformable, and it's only when you've actually when you draw it out that it gets the good up-down properties again. So this single cheapest thing on the planet actually has a significant amount of processing like into it in the design, right? It's actually processed, and then you make the bag around the way that it's processed. So the extremely short explanation of what's actually happening is that the molecules of the plastic are very long chains, and so they start off with some orientation. When you pull on it lengthwise, you're pulling on the chains that are kind of already oriented, right? So imagine like you're pulling on string, right, or pulling on fabric where they're all already kind of lined up. But then when you pull on it crosswise, you're pulling them apart. So it's easier to pull them away from each other than it is to pull them in the direction that they're already in. And again, you can imagine if you have like a bundle of like fibers, right, pulling in the direction of the fibers versus pulling them apart is noticeably different. They're much more entangled than fibers. Fibers are actually very carefully just like not entangled, whereas these polymers are somewhat entangled, which is why it doesn't fall apart when you pull it sideways, but you can change the properties when you pull it sideways. I'm happy to nerd out about anything I talk about actually now that you're like, oh, wait, I wish I want to hear more about that. Come find me at the reception because I'm perfectly happy to talk about pretty much anything in material science in some depth. But I am going to move on. So the next thing I want to actually sort of illustrate is in some use cases for 3D printing, which you may have heard of. So one is these are actually, they're already being widely used in dentistry to make molds for orthodontics. And so in this case, the physical properties of it, so it takes advantage of the fact like every body is different, right? Everybody's mouth is different. So actually being able to make multiple copies of this by scanning and 3D printing instead of putting like when I had braces, I had a mouthful of goo, right, which is what they're made out of. And I have to say the idea of scanning my mouth instead is pretty appealing. So, the one obvious use case is that since every body is different, something that actually is about the sort of specificity totally makes sense. This is an example of someone who had a bone cancer in her jaw, and the blue is actually a titanium replacement for it. So there's a couple of things I want you to notice here. So one is the blue, you can tell, even if it wasn't false colored, you would be able to tell instantly what was the human designed element here and what was the biological component, right? The skull versus the mandible. But the second thing that I actually want to take a moment to talk about is, so this jaw is 3D printed. So it's like the idea would be they scanned her skull, and then they reconstructed what the mandible should be, and then 3D printed it as sort of a custom implant, and then it was implanted. So remember I said that this is like a single processing technique? So I'm going to give you an example of one of the many ways in which processing really matters, especially for things like biomedical implants. So this is a Bjork-Schiley convexo-concave heart valve, as it says. What that means is in your heart, which is a pump, right? So this is I apologize to all biologists because I'm going to give you the incredibly simplified. Your heart is a pump, and it pumps blood, and there's a high pressure system which pumps blood to your body, and there's a low pressure system that pumps blood to your lungs, and so there's 4 valves in it. And that basically control this. Your heart is actually sort of 2 halves that do the same thing at different pressures. So this is a heart valve for people who have either congenital or other problems with these heart valves. Heart valves in the body, as you might imagine, look nothing like this one that's made of pyrolytical carbon and titanium and dacron. So when these were first manufactured, they were implanted and they spot welded the struts that hold that disc tips back and forth. So they spot welded those struts that hold it in place. And then they implanted them in the body, and then they discovered pretty much the hard way that the welding of those titanium struts changed the physical properties enough that it was not resistant to corrosion in the incredibly warm, salty, and otherwise pretty nasty environment of our body. And so they actually redesigned this so that the struts are actually now CNC machined in one piece. So that they don't actually have spot welds anymore. So to me, this is like I do a lot of stuff in biomedical materials, and so it's this reminder that the processing really, really, really matters. I could probably tell you 5 other stories like this off the top of my head, where very, very subtle differences in the processing of the materials led to vastly different outcomes when it was implanted in the body. So whether it's plastic bags or katanas or bread or a medical implant, this kind of processing really matters. How am I doing for time? 26 minutes. Okay. So go the other way. So one of the things why 3D printing is interesting for someone, particularly someone who comes from a biological background, is that it means that you can algorithmically generate, again, as Charlotte was saying, I love the fact that we're bookending this. You can algorithmic, so her wires were, or her necklaces were generated by humans using a generative algorithm. The other approach is to actually use generative algorithms with less direct human intervention. And so this is the work of nervous system. It's Jesse and Jessica Rosenkrantz, who are my neighbors. They're in the next town, Ober in Somerville. And they do deeply biologically inspired 3D printed objects. So they actually create algorithms that, I was going to say, on the one hand, mimic the types of forms you see in nature. And of course, there's some good arguments to be made that the biological systems are using the same algorithms, they're just running on a different substrate, right? And so instead of being done as code, it's being done in sort of physical interaction. So again, the sort of computation directly with the materials, and in this case, the biology. So they make these sort of gorgeous algorithmically generated artifacts. So these are lights, but they make jewelry, and they make sort of a number of other things. I highly recommend checking them out as Christmas is coming, alongside the necklace you're going to buy from Charlotte's site. So, these are two. Both of these are for joining cables, for attaching cables. So the one on the left is sort of the traditionally formed kind. The one on the right was made by basically sort of creating the system and then iteratively looking at where are the loads on the system. So if you run a cable through each of these loads, each of those holes, you put stress on those cables, you have this object, and then you say, okay, well now I'm going to say, can I minimize the amount of stress, right? Where should I put material, or if the material isn't being used, where should I take it away, right? And then you run it again and again and again to create an object, to create a connector that uses the minimum amount of material that provides adequate strength for this use. And this was done by Arab. And so when they did this is what they came up with. So, and then it was 3D printed in metal, I think probably steel, as this sort of cable joint. So the thing that was incredibly, it might be obvious to you and it was incredibly striking to me, is the resemblance this has. So this looks stunningly biological, right? And it actually looks an extraordinary amount like bone. So I spent the better part of 10 years studying bone. It's what I did my graduate work in. And bone operates on kind of the same principle, which is that when you apply mechanical loads to it, it produces more bone. And when it isn't actually needed, that bone goes away. And so, if you lift weights, you are actually building muscle, but you're also building bone. If you're an astronaut going to Mars, or even an astronaut on the space station, your bone that's not in use is actually being taken away. And in fact, this is actually, NASA's doing a ton of research, right, on how to make sure that if we're going to have a crewed mission to Mars, that when people arrive, even in low gravity, you don't actually want to have bones that are easily breaking. So this is happening in your body kind of all the time. And so what this is it's a cross-section of your, it's a cross-section, it's a cross-section of your, are we live? Okay. It's a cross-section of the ball joint of your hip, so where it actually goes into your pelvis, so it's kind of this piece. And so if you draw a cross-section of it this way, like this way, this is what you're looking at. You see the sort of interior of this bone structure. And the two things I want to point out to you are, one, see that kind of diagonal, if you kind of squint at it, there's kind of a diagonal line, right? So most of the bone is kind of lined up in the direction it needs to be to take the weight of your torso and transmit it to your legs. And so the bone is lined up where there's kind of the maximal stress. And then the other thing over here is looking at it at a microscale, right? Looking at this kind of structure and seeing that structure has a structure very similar to the one that we just saw in that algorithmically generated, or sort of iterative stress generated system. So let me put this back. Let me go here. So I said there's two things I wanted to talk about. One was process, right? And the other one was this idea of structures that are in between what it's made out of and what its properties are. And so one of my background, my main field is biological materials. And this is sort of the hallmark of biological materials, is that they have these hierarchical structures kind of all the way through. And so the bone here is just an example of it. So I noticed earlier, it's like I took out the octopus slide, Matt, but I do have a spider slide. And so this is true for almost all biological materials. And so these are three of what I think about as the charismatic megafauna in this world. So a redwood tree, spider silk, and nacre, right, which is sort of mother of pearl inside seashells. So people are really interested. They have all of these things have remarkable properties, right? The usual sort of saying is that if you took a spider web and you scaled it up, it could stop a fighter jet, right? If you had it on the same scale. And so the idea is, okay, let's try to like make, particularly if you're the military, let's try to like make artificial spider silk. And so some of you have probably heard of spider goats, and making spider silk in goats, in goat milk. And the problem is that spiders actually have a lot of super complicated processing that happens in the spinnerets that turns the sort of liquid silk into the structure that it has that gives it the properties at the end. So you can put it in goat milk, right? But you don't actually go through that same sort of processing to get those properties. So and you do get interesting and worthwhile properties, but they're not going to be the same as the ones that you get if it comes out of a spider. And so similarly. So this is a close-up of nacre, which is the structure, the internal structure of mother of pearl. So it's basically 99 and change % calcium carbonate, which is basically like chalk or limestone, right? It's like, except that seashells, of course, besides being beautiful, right, they actually have very different physical properties. They're much, much stronger than and much more resistant to damage than they just don't crack anywhere near as easily. Which if you're if you're an abalone and there's all those evil sea otters around who want to eat you, right? Having resistance to your shell being broken is the thing that kind of saves you. So the structure of this, actually, the reason why nacre is so beautiful is because those plates, which is the sort of plates of calcium carbonate that make up the nacre, are on the order of the wavelength of light. So it means that when light hits it, it interferes with it. So the light bounces off in different ways, and then the light waves interfere with each other, and that's what gives it its beautiful colors. In between those plates, remember I said it's 99 point something %? In between those plates is a tiny bit of protein, and it's that protein that actually shapes the structure of those plates. And what it means is that if you're a crack and you want to run from one side to the other, you end up kind of running your way, and this is a photo of a crack, kind of running your way around the plate. So it's actually much more difficult than it would be if you think about breaking a piece of glass, right, where a crack just kind of runs straight across. You can put the pieces back together again. This is much more challenging. So that's one of the reasons why it's much stronger. And so it really has to do with this sort of level of properties in between. So I said that those are charismatic megafauna. This is a very not charismatic megafauna. This is a nest cell lining of a species of bee called Calides inequalis. It's actually, so it looks like clear plastic. The yellow stuff inside it is a mixture of nectar and pollen, and somewhere inside that would also be an egg. And so the egg would hatch, and it would eat all those provisions. And then, because these are actually underground, you can see the sort of sandy dirt around it, then they would dig their way up and then start this process over again. I dug this up in a field, 20 miles from where I live. These bees, Calides, are endemic across. I don't know if there's any in Iceland. There's definitely a bunch in Europe and a bunch in the US. And in lots of places. So that thing that looks like clear plastic is in fact polyester. It's actually a silk-reinforced polyester. And that was the thing that we showed. And the reason why I'm showing this and the reason why I think it's interesting, aside from the fact that it's bees making like plastic Ziploc bags, is I guess because bees make plastic Ziploc bags. One of the challenges we have is that I talked about all of these processing techniques and I talked about all these materials, but if we want to move away from things like fossil fuel derived plastics that basically last forever in our environment, then we need to basically start thinking about having that same diversity of what materials do we want to use and have that same diversity of processing techniques and outcomes that we can use for things like replacement types of plastic. So right now we're really good at making things like this. We're not really good at making things that, for example, so in the case of these, they survive in the soil, which is an incredibly harsh environment, especially in a place like Massachusetts, where there's kind of a 70-degree Celsius swing in temperature, right? It can be minus 30 in the winter, and it could be 40 degrees in the summer. It's wet. And then, of course, there's all the active, like pathogens and other insects. So this protects the innards, but then eventually it degrades. And we know it eventually degrades because otherwise we'd be up to our eyeballs in them from the last ice age. So there's some space here for saying, okay, what can we learn? So we have this processing, and we have this structure of biological materials, and then we have these sort of families of biological materials that we can learn from in ways that would be useful for us to look at alternatives to sort of our current mode of doing things. So I'm going to kind of wrap up by saying that, there's all these, biological materials to me is characterized by all this stuff that's happening in the middle scale. It's true of all materials, but it's really true, it's more true. It is the characteristic of biological materials, that it has a bunch of hierarchy and scale in the middle. And of course, as Janine Benyus has noted in her book Biomimicry, most of these materials are produced under sort of energy, like energy poor conditions, right? So it's like those seashells were made at room temperature, well, at 4 degrees Celsius, probably in the ocean, right? Under kind of ambient conditions. There was no high temperature involved, right? So the 3D printing of glass, where it's like, molten and glowing orange, right? That's not how seashells get made. So I'm going to leave with my favorite definition of technology, which is Ursula K. Le Guin's. Technology is the active human interface with the material world. So it's not just electronics. It includes things like textiles and bread making and all the tools that we make, and that fundamentally this is what technology is and what technology is for. Thank you.